The silence in our home had become a physical presence, a third occupant that settled into the plush sofa and echoed in the stainless steel kitchen. It was a silence born not of peace, but of neglect. For Sarah, it was the loudest sound she heard each day. She'd trace the patterns on the granite countertop, waiting for the familiar crunch of tires on the driveway that signaled Mark's return from work, but when he arrived, the silence simply reshaped itself, making room for his distracted nods and the constant glow of his phone screen. Rough day at the office, he'd murmur, pecking her cheek without really seeing her. Sarah would nod, swallowing down the stories of her own day, the freelance graphic design project she'd landed, the funny thing the cashier at the grocery store had said, the lingering loneliness that had followed her from room to room. Her words seemed to evaporate in the space between them, unimportant, uninteresting. They were like two satellites orbiting the same planet, never colliding, but never truly connecting. Date nights were replaced with Mark working late, conversations about future dreams were supplanted by discussions of quarterly reports. Sarah felt herself fading, becoming a ghost in the life they had built together. One particularly bleak Tuesday, the walls of the house felt like they were closing in. The rain streaked down the windows, mirroring the damp ache in her heart. Mark had left for work before she woke and had texted he'd be super late. Without a purpose, Sarah pulled on a raincoat, grabbed her purse, and drove aimlessly until she found herself outside a small, slightly shabby antique shop called the Gilded Finch, tucked away on a side street she'd never noticed before. A bell tinkled overhead as she pushed the door open, the scent of old paper, lemon polish, and time washing over her. The shop was a labyrinth of forgotten treasures. Sunlight strained through the dusty windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. She ran her fingers over the spine of a leather-bound book, feeling the cool, textured grain. It was in the quietest corner that she found it. A watercolor painting of a lone bench nestled under a massive, sprawling oak tree, the light filtering through the leaves in a golden-green haze. It was peaceful, yet profoundly lonely. It spoke to her. "That's a special one," a gentle, raspy voice said behind her. Sarah turned to find an elderly man with kind eyes the color of the summer sky and a head of soft, white hair. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace. "It was painted by my wife, Eleanor," he said, a soft smile touching his lips. "She always said that bench was the best listener in the world." "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, her throat tight. "I'm Arthur," he said, extending a slightly trembling hand. Sarah, that was the beginning. Something about Arthur's calm presence and the unhurried atmosphere of the shop drew her back, again and again. At first, her visits were brief, a 5-minute chat, a comment on the weather. But soon, they stretched into hours. She'd help him dust the shelves or organize a box of old postcards, and he'd tell her stories. Stories about Eleanor, a woman with a laugh that could chase the clouds away, about their travels, their silly arguments, and their deep, abiding love that had lasted 52 years. Sarah, in turn, began to share pieces of herself. She told him about her work, her dreams of illustrating a children's book, and eventually, haltingly, about the growing distance between her and Mark. "He doesn't see me anymore, Arthur," she confessed one afternoon, her voice small. "It's like I'm part of the furniture." Arthur was silent for a moment, polishing an old brass compass. "Grief comes in many forms, Sarah," he said softly. "It's not just for those who have passed. We can grieve for a relationship that's changed, for a connection that's been lost. It sounds like you're grieving, and perhaps Mark is, too, in his own way. He may be grieving the man he thought he'd be, or the life he imagined, and he's too busy fighting his own ghosts to see he's neglecting the living." His words struck a chord so deep it vibrated within her. She had been so focused on her own pain that she hadn't considered Mark might be carrying a weight of his own. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a perspective that softened the edges of her resentment. Arthur's friendship became her anchor. He encouraged her art, clearing off a small table in the back of the shop for her to use as a studio. He was her first audience, her gentle critic. Under his quiet belief, the part of her that had been withering began to bloom again. She felt seen, heard, and valued. The turning point came on the day of Arthur's late wife's birthday. Sarah found him sitting in the back room, holding the painting of the oak tree bench, his shoulders slumped in a silent sorrow so profound it filled the room. "I still talk to her, you know," he said, not looking up. "Every day." The silence she left behind, it's a heavy thing. Sarah sat beside him, placing her hand over his. "Tell me about her birthday traditions." And he did. He told her how Eleanor loved yellow roses and lemon cake, and how they would always have a picnic, no matter the weather. An idea sparked in Sarah's mind. She spent the rest of the day baking a lopsided but heartfelt lemon cake and tracking down a bouquet of the last yellow roses of the season. When she presented them to Arthur, the look on his face was one of pure, unvarnished love and gratitude. It was a moment of profound, platonic connection that filled a chamber of her heart she hadn't known was empty. She was giving comfort, not just receiving it. That evening, she returned home, her spirit lighter yet resolute. She found Mark on the sofa, the blue light of the television flickering across his tired face. But this time, instead of retreating to her office with a sigh, she walked over and sat beside him, turning off the TV. Mark, she said, her voice calm but firm. We need to talk. Really talk. He looked at her, startled by the directness in her tone. And for the first time in a long time, he really looked at her. He saw the determination in her eyes, the new lightness in her posture, the woman who was emerging from the shadow of neglect. She didn't accuse or blame. She used the language Arthur had unknowingly taught her, the language of shared grief and quiet strength. I feel like we've both been lost, she began. And I miss you. I miss us. Mark's defenses crumbled. The story poured out of him. The immense pressure he felt at work, the fear of failure, the shame of not being the perfect provider. He'd been so buried in his own anxiety that he had built walls to keep the pressure in, not realizing he was locking her out. He apologized, his voice thick with emotion, and for the first time in years, they held each other, not out of habit, but out of a shared need for connection. The healing was slow. It required conscious effort, scheduled date nights, and a mutual pact to put phones away after 7 p.m. But the foundation was being repaired. Sarah introduced Mark to Arthur, and a beautiful, unexpected thing happened. Mark, a man who dealt in data and logic, found a strange solace in Arthur's stories and old-world wisdom. He started joining Sarah on her visits to the Gilded Finch, sometimes just to sit and listen. One Saturday afternoon, they all walked to the real park, to the very bench from Eleanor's painting. The oak tree was just as majestic, the light filtering through its leaves just as golden. Sarah and Mark sat together on the bench, their hands intertwined, while Arthur stood a little ways off, a peaceful smile on his face as he looked up at the tree. She would have loved you both, Arthur said, his voice soft with memory and certainty. Sarah leaned her head on Mark's shoulder, feeling the solid, present warmth of him. The silence between them now was different. It was no longer an empty void of neglect, but a comfortable, peaceful space, filled with the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the unspoken promise of a future they would build together, stronger and more connected than before. She had gone into the antique shop looking for an escape from her loneliness, but she had found something far more valuable. She had found a friend who taught her about enduring love, about the courage to face grief, and about the quiet strength it takes to rebuild. The comfort she had found in that unexpected place hadn't just saved her, it had saved her marriage, guiding them both back from the brink and into the light.